All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're deconstructing a mythic fable all about the goddess of love, Aphrodite. But we're going to treat this analysis kind of like a dark graphic novel, where absolute divine beauty is really just masking some deep systemic flaws. We so often look at ancient mythology through this lens of absolute reverence. But today, we're totally flipping the script. We're blending ancient philosophy with the philological study of these historical texts to really expand on her story and her archetypal role. The goal here is to look past her highly voluptuous design and uncover the incredibly destructive nature of unchecked primordial desire.
So I want to start by asking a pretty provocative question. Where exactly does heroism hide in vanity? It's a question meant to completely challenge our fundamental assumptions about Olympian deities. We're just so used to associating these ancient figures with heroic myth journeys, right? We just assume that because they're gods, their stories naturally map onto a noble framework. But when we look specifically at Aphrodite, we really have to ask ourselves if that assumption is actually a massive flaw in how we consume mythology.
I absolutely love this quote because it hits the nail right on the head, how utterly absurd it is to demand a heroic journey from a deity who spent her entire existence lounging on Mount Olympus while mortals bled for her amusement. I mean, wow, that perfectly captures the central conflict of our explainer today. It reveals this stark philosophical contrast between true bleeding heroes and a totally static divine instigator. It really forces us to confront a harsh mythological reality. Olympian deities, and Aphrodite in particular, do not undergo heroic quests. Instead, they serve as the obstacles, the instigators, or the capricious patrons for mortals who are honestly far braver than they ever could be.
Okay, moving right into section 1, the heroic journey fallacy.
To really grasp this fallacy, we have to look at the actual definition of classical heroism. True heroism, it requires real grit. It's about martial valor and genuine moral growth through literal trials of fire. Think about the grueling journeys of demigods like Heracles or Perseus. A true hero elevates humanity through sacrifice. They go into the underworld to save others. They put their own safety on the line for the greater good. Now, notice the stark juxtaposition here. On one hand, you've got the earned power of a true hero on the demigod's path, trials of fire, massive sacrifice, actual moral growth. And then you have the Olympians' reality. While demigods are out there earning their power, what is Aphrodite doing? She's literally lounging on thrones held up by mindless servants. She's acting as a divine instigator, manipulating the hearts of mortals, and essentially just using humanity as a mere playground for her own caprices. Which brings us to section 2, the intoxicating curse of allure. So, if she didn't earn her power through some fiery trial, where on earth did it come from? Well, our sources highlight that it was a purely passive inheritance. It acted as this innate, intoxicating curse of absolute allure that just gave her instant dominion over gods and men alike. She didn't have to study, she didn't train, and she certainly didn't sacrifice to achieve this status. She simply arrived with it, demanding unconditional worship purely by virtue of her existence. Honestly, her only true journey was simply rising passively from the sea foam. And sure, think about that imagery for a second. It is a breathtaking visual spectacle, absolutely. But it is a spectacle of vanity, not a triumph of courage or martial valor. To call her a hero, or to try and project the noble framework of a hero's journey onto a goddess whose greatest mythological achievement was literally just being too beautiful to ignore, that's an insult to the very definition of classical heroism. All right, let's look at the real-world fallout of all this in Section 3, Judgment and Catastrophic Vanity. We really need to trace this rapid escalation of chaos because it happens fast. It starts at point 1, the Judgment of Paris. Now, this was not some noble quest. It was a moment completely driven by petty vanity and a super fragile ego. She just had to have that golden apple. She had to be named the most beautiful. So moving to point 2, she manipulated mortal hearts to get it. And what did that spark lead to? Point 3, the catastrophic Trojan War. Just because of her vanity, an entire generation of real heroes was dragged into a decade of horrific, bloody, and completely senseless slaughter. This whole mythological disaster perfectly captures what psychologists and scholars of myth call the shadow side of the lover archetype. When primordial desire is left completely unchecked, rational thought goes right out the window. It just becomes entirely about obsessive gratification. And as we saw with Troy, this brand of divine, anti-heroic vanity doesn't just ruffle a few feathers, it shatters families and completely ruins kingdoms.
This leads us directly into Section 4, Mortal Blood, Divine Cowardice.
Comparing these metrics lays out a frankly embarrassing difference. Under mortal heroism, you have soldiers out there bleeding, sacrificing everything, and fighting on the front lines to defend a noble cause. But look over at divine vanity. The very second the mortal hero Diomedes barely grazed her delicate wrist in battle, what did Aphrodite do? Did she fight through the pain for a cause? No way. She whimpered and immediately fled straight back to Mount Olympus, going right back to her lounging and her amusement.
And this behavior really reinforces a massive philosophical takeaway about her character. She is entirely static. She never sought self-improvement. She never learned a single thing from her mistakes. Instead, she just stayed there, lounging in luxury on thrones held up by mindless servants, doing absolutely nothing to elevate humanity, yet constantly demanding our absolute adoration.
Let's tie this ancient mythology to a modern sociological concept in our final section. Section 5, the original toxic celebrity. This really illustrates her complete lack of transformative growth. We can basically map out the psychology of this divine instigator into a distinct four-step loop. Step 1, superficial desire. Step 2, jealousy kicks in the second that desire is threatened. Step 3, lustful action to grab that attention back. And step 4, demanding absolute worship. Because her character is trapped in this unending, totally static loop, genuine moral development is literally impossible for her. She's an anti-hero because she is completely incapable of overcoming her own worst traits.
Her interactions with the mortal realm were driven entirely by selfish whims. I mean, if mortal women neglected her altars, she cursed them. She treated tragic figures like Adonis, not as equals to be loved, but basically as mere possessions for her own personal pleasure. She completely reduced humanity to a playground, punishing anyone who didn't feed her ego and demanding unearned worship simply for being incredibly beautiful.
So I'll leave you with this final, somewhat provocative thought to chew on. Why do we still worship the unearned? Because honestly, when you strip away the beautiful marble statues and the ancient poetry, Aphrodite's static, unearned mythological footprint looks an awful lot like the toxic celebrity culture we obsess over today. The next time you see someone elevated purely for their aesthetic allure, commanding all this attention while causing absolute chaos for everyone around them, ask yourself, are we still just worshiping Olympian instigators in disguise? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope it completely changes how you look at the goddess of love.